So, all right. Can you see the Socratic seminar page now?
I can see the Socratic seminar page. I can't see a slideshow.
Oh,
Remember to share your
okay.
screen and share it
Oh,
with
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. All right. I can do that right now.
Okay.
Let me see. Okay. I want to share screen one. Share. Okay. There we go. Now, okay. Can you see the
Yeah.
whole screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Well, here we go. This is because we have no students this morning. Mrs. Campbell and I are going to do the Socratic seminar, kind of like a lecture, dual lecture here, and it's on the Odyssey for our 9th grade students, and we're going to post this to our pages. So, welcome.
Hi.
All right. Hi. Okay. Here's a little background info on Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. Prior to Homer writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, the stories that would eventually comprise these two epic poems were recited by storytellers. And in this way, the stories were passed down from generation to generation. And this kind of epic was called an oral epic because the stories were passed down from generation to generation orally. But then something amazing happened. And what happened was that Homer took many of these stories and he wrote them down and created a new kind of epic. And this kind of epic was called the art epic because he created works of art in writing the Iliad and the Odyssey. Did you want to add anything to that, Mrs. Campbell?
Well, the oral tradition of this, I don't know if anybody, you look in your textbook and you see just how long that is. And I don't know if the students realize that these are only little snippets from the actual Odyssey. The Iliad is at least twice the size of the Odyssey. So what you have to realize is there were people who memorized the poem. That's why it was presented in a poem, because it did make it easier to remember. But imagine having the two entire documents in your head and being able to relate that so that it was in, and the more that people heard it, the more that they were able to repeat the stories as well. So it's just an awesome thought that these were learned and memorized by people.
Great. Yeah, that's true. It's pretty amazing. And there were actually what you might call epic conventions that those people who memorized the epics used to help them memorize parts of them, like the Homeric simile and the Homeric epithet. Those were actually used to help the storytellers memorize certain parts, right?
Right.
Okay, great. So, some background about Homer. It has been widely believed that Homer was blind. Moreover, it has been said that he was from Ionia, and Ionia was a region in West Asia Minor, and it's believed that the poems were composed in the 8th or 7th century BC, and the Homeric epics have had a great influence on artists throughout the centuries who have created visual art and music and literature based on the Iliad and the Odyssey. And several years ago, when I was into listening to rock music, I actually found an album called The Odyssey. And it told the Odyssey from beginning to end. It was like this epic rock album. It was pretty interesting. So Homer's works also had a great influence on Greek culture and education.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to say anything about that, Mrs. Campbell?
Nope, just, yep, that's great.
Okay. All right. So, what is an epic? An epic is a long story and oftentimes a narrative poem. You know, there are basically two types of poetry. One type of poetry is called narrative poetry, which tells stories, and the other type of poetry is called lyric poetry, which is more emotional. And generally, shorter poems are called lyric poems, and longer poems like the Odyssey and the Iliad are called narrative poems, in which a hero journeys across a vast expanse of geography so as to achieve a goal. And we know that in the Iliad, Odysseus and the Achaeans journey, the Greeks journey from Greece to Troy to try to retrieve Helen and punish the Trojans for taking her. So the hero must journey from the known world into the unknown world so as to begin his or her quest. And this is actually uh, something that Joseph Campbell talks about in many of his books.
Yeah.
And
No relation,
yeah.
by the way.
Oh, no relation. Okay, I just got that. Okay, so for an elderly person, an epic journey might be walking to the market with his or her walker, navigating the cracks in the sidewalk. So the context of the epic can change depending on, the situation of the epic hero. Sometimes the hero falls into the quest, and sometimes the hero purposefully decides to go on his or her quest, maybe because they're bored of their current life. Their life has become stale for some reason and they want something greater. But like I said, sometimes the hero falls into the quest and that the quest just begins. Did you want to say something about that, Mrs. Campbell?
Are you going to be talking about archetype pretty soon? Because
I could talk about narrative archetype of romance.
Well, and the archetypes themselves, when you have the epics, the archetypes are, like who is the archetypal hero. So there's going to be certain characteristics, and so the epic employs some of these. The archetypal, you have the mentor, you have the hero, you have the who's the villain? I'm losing some of the terms here that Campbell came up with, but the and that's
nemesis.
The nemesis, yes. That's why when we study these things, Harry Potter is an epic. And he's the archetypal hero. And then there's archetypal characters surrounding him. Same thing with Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games. And so it's a pattern that is followed. And the whole point of it is to show what a person has to go through for betterment of his or herself. And
that's right.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to add.
Oh, wonderful. And I completely agree with you. Sometimes the hero falls into the quest, and sometimes the hero purposefully decides to go on his or her quest. Moreover, the hero faces challenges and temptations, often is given a special guide or mentor, and that's exactly what you were talking about, Mrs. Campbell, to help him or her, often is given a special weapon, journeys into the land of the dead for private knowledge, and returns home to set things right and to demonstrate that a kind of transformation has taken place in the hero and in his or her home, and perhaps even in his or her community as well. So the hero has gained valuable experience on his or her quest and sometimes comes home with physical treasure as well as what you earlier said, Mrs. Campbell, about learning to understand the self better. Does that? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and that was the purpose of any kind of the creative aspect. So anything written, anything orally spoken. The whole point of it was the betterment of the self.
Great. Okay, so the invocation of the Muse. If you look at page 651 in your book. And I don't think you and I have to look at that right now because I have the lines from that page written here. But the invocation of the Muse. Now, in the Odyssey in your textbook, students, page 651, sing in me, Muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending. Okay, and of course, it's talking about Odysseus here. All right, and so it goes on, and line 16 says, of these adventures, Muse, daughter of Zeus, tell us in our time, lift the great song again. And so this is the storyteller, and this came from the oral tradition that Mrs. Campbell was talking about. And it demonstrates a kind of prayer that the storyteller makes to the Muse, the muse Calliope, who is the muse of epic poetry, to help the storyteller tell the tale, recite the poem in the most elevated and elegant way possible. So it's the idea that there is this reality that is beyond the physical reality, that is the spiritual reality, and the storyteller is trying to tap into that consciousness to help him tell the story in the best way possible. Does that make sense to you, Mrs. Campbell?
Yeah, yeah. And remember the how theistic the society was, and so the gods had power over everything, so it would make sense for the narrator to invoke the muse in order so that because like I said, if you look at this massive volume, how could anyone possibly memorize that? So the belief was that the muse would help to relate that and help them to remember what the story is. And there is some supernatural belief behind it because of the society that they were in.
That's right. So moving on, Calliope is the muse of epic poetry. She is one of the 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. And Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory, and that's why I always keep forgetting her name.
I think there's a mnemonic for that, isn't there?
There's got to be. Yep. So the 9 muses were goddesses who inspired storytellers and writers and visual artists and scientists. And so the invocation of the muse is what's called an epic convention, or a pattern that we usually see in epics. And so my question for the students was going to be, what might the purpose of the invocation of the muse be? I guess I'll have to answer that.
Well, I do it just a while ago.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I think you did, but I'd like to, and you
Go
did
ahead.
a wonderful job in answering that. But I'd like to add another little thing
Sure.
that I was thinking about, because I really hadn't thought about the answer that you gave, which was very insightful. The answer that I came up with was that doing this created a kind of formal feeling or tone to the epic, such that it elevated the epic to a very high state in terms of its value in literature, especially in the art epic.
Right.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, so then normally I give the essay prompt at the end of the Socratic seminar, but I decided here to give it early. So here it is. In order to understand Odysseus' characteristics, it is important to understand that he is an epic hero, and as such, he displays characteristics that are both heroic as well as human. Write an essay in which you describe both Odysseus' heroic traits as well as his human traits, and be sure to use evidence from the epic poem to support your analysis. That means use quotations. So, did you want to say anything about that prompt, Mrs. Campbell?
Just that it's a literary analysis, and so we're going to be showing you what a literary analysis essay is and how to do that. And the important part of that prompt is the last part. It's not enough to say Odysseus was very brave. In fact, it's really not even enough to say he was very brave when he took on Polyphemus, the Cyclops. You have to actually describe what he did and what that exactly shows, because he wasn't just brave in that situation. He was cunning, he was inventive. By the way that they had to sharpen the trunk of that long tree branch. Well, it's a spear. He creates the spear, and he knew not to kill Polyphemus until he didn't want to kill him because somebody had to roll the stone back. And so you have to go through and you have to describe all those traits. So but I'm sure we'll get into having you we'll show you how to do that.
Great. Okay, thank you. Homeric epithets. is going to be the next epic convention that we're going to discuss. And a Homeric epithet is a word or words of adjectival import. That's a fancy way to say they're adjectives that qualifies or qualify. I'm so pretentious, I don't know why. That qualifies or qualify or characterizes or characterize a person or thing, usually an important person or thing, in such a way that an important quality of the person or thing is highlighted. So let me give you an example. Students, on page 652, line 47, we are shown the term divine calypso. Divine is the Homeric epithet describing calypso. So divine acts as an adjective describing the proper noun calypso. And it describes an important aspect of calypso. Okay, so how does the word Ogygia apply to divine calypso? That's where she lives. So turn to page 654. Now look at line 101. Notice versatile Odysseus. And that's exactly what you were saying about Odysseus earlier, Mrs. Campbell, in terms of the way in which he acted in regards to the Cyclops. He was versatile. So what would be the Homeric epithet here, students? And the Homeric epithet would be versatile because it describes Odysseus. Now, another thing is that these days the word epithet doesn't really mean what it means in terms of the Homeric epithet. These days, an epithet is a bad name that you assign to somebody, usually to attempt to marginalize them or dehumanize them in some way. So that is the essence of, but this, in terms of Homeric epithets, is what is important. So
aren't epithets also used on tombstones? Don't they apply epithets? So whatever is written on the tombstone is considered an epithet?
Perhaps. Yeah, maybe. I'm sure you're right. Okay, so considering the writing prompt, it may be a good thing for you to look for other Homeric epithets that Homer uses to describe Odysseus, and use those to highlight his heroic traits, because the Homeric epithets really speak about his heroism, his epic qualities. Did you want to say anything
I
about
had never
that,
noticed that before, actually, and I think that's a great idea because those epithets do pinpoint, they're little red flags that pinpoint, hey, here's a piece of evidence that you can use for this. And there's all kinds of different adjectives used to describe him. So I hadn't noticed that before. And the epithet on the tombstone, it is kind of like defining that person. And that's why you said earlier, in today's society, it's a negative version of that. But in past, it had always been positive, that this was, the definition of who this person was characteristically. So.
Good. Okay, so moving on, Homeric similes. If you turn to page 665, students, and look at line 368, you will see that Odysseus describes the way he blinded the Cyclops, and he compares his heroic action of blinding the Cyclops to the everyday action of men drilling a hole in the planking of a ship. And so this is the essence of what a Homeric simile is. It compares heroic action or godlike action to everyday action. And the reason it does that is because context is everything. If we can understand the context of the heroic action in terms of the everyday action, then we can understand how the heroic action looked. Like, for example, at the beginning of your book, I think, at the beginning of the Odyssey in your book, there's a Homeric simile that describes Hermes actually flying from his home, skimming across the water as a seagull flies. And the reason that Homeric simile is done that way is to help people understand how he looked when he flew. Because if you ask someone, have you ever seen a god fly? they would say no. And so they wouldn't have any context for understanding how that looked. But if you asked
Right.
them, have you ever seen a seagull fly? They would go, oh, yeah. Well, that's how the god looked when he
Mm-hmm.
flew. And so it's kind of the same here with this Homeric simile about the Cyclops and blinding him.
Mm-hmm.
And um, you know, the last sentence in the kind of the first paragraph there on the screen says this comparison works for at least a couple of different reasons. And one reason, I don't want to put you on the spot, Mrs. Campbell, so I'm going to answer these unless you want to. It's up to you.
Well, the one I'm thinking of is that it brings the human and the god-like worlds together. It's a connection of the spiritual and the secular. To me, that's what I get from them. So that that it actually elevates man. So that when you do the comparison with the seagull and seeing the seagull fly, that means that if they've been familiar with this poem, then anytime they see a seagull fly over the waves of the ocean, they're going to be reminded of Hermes, and they're going to be reminded of the world, the what's the word I'm looking for? It's the spiritual world that's around them.
Great. Yeah, good point. And so I think that results in a kind of an elevation of the form of the work.
Yes.
Yeah, and what I was going to suggest, I hadn't really thought of that aspect, and I'm really glad you mentioned it. But what I was thinking was that the Cyclops is compared to a ship because it's so big
Mm-hmm.
and powerful in comparison to Odysseus and his crew.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons that this Homeric simile actually works pretty well,
Mm-hmm.
demonstrating the what you might call the inequality of power in the situation. And it
Right.
looks at first like the Cyclops, who is this huge monster and has this amazing power, will be able to triumph, but actually Odysseus does. Oh, and what I was going to say, I think I'll come across that later in a different slide. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, so moving on. I want to make sure that this is the right slide. Did I just? Yeah, that's the slide I just showed.
Yeah.
So there it is. Journey to the underworld for private knowledge. Okay, this is what epic heroes do. And some that I can think of might be Orpheus, Dante,
Pegasus or Perseus.
Perseus. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know about Perseus going to the underworld.
Well, the going where Medusa is. It's kind of like because there's a literal underworld and then there's a figurative underworld.
Right, exactly.
So, like for example, students, when you were doing that first exercise with the Hunger Games, I mean, there's no real underworld in the Hunger Games. However, they do go into a cave. Peeta and Katniss go into a cave, and then there's a journey in there. But also, to some extent, the arena itself is like an underworld because it's where death is. And so it's confronting death, really, is what the journey to the underworld is.
Excellent. Yeah, great point. And oftentimes it's intuitive. It's not rational.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this slide now. Journey to the underworld for private knowledge. The significance of going into the underworld is that it is where a person can gain private knowledge that nobody else on the face of the earth is privy to. And so if you turn to page 676, students, and look at line 604, and you read a little from there, and you'll see that Tiresias tells Odysseus something about the god who thunders on the land. So what does Tiresias tell him about the god who thunders on the land, or Poseidon? Let's see, maybe I can get my book out here and
Okay.
read that. Let's
604.
see.
I have it in front of me.
Okay. 676, line
Mhm.
604. Okay, do you want to read it?
Sure. And I'm reading to which line?
I don't
Okay.
know. I'm not
Um,
sure. I'll stop
all
you.
right. Just stop me when you need to. Meanwhile, I crouched with my drawn sword to keep the
Okay.
surging phantoms from the bloody pit till I should know the presence of Tiresias. Soon from the dark that prince of Thebes came forward bearing a golden staff, and he addressed me, son of Laertes and the gods of old. Odysseus, master of landways and seaways, why leave the blazing sun, O man of woe, to see the cold dead in the joyless region? Stand clear, put up your sword, let me but taste of blood, I shall speak true. At this I stepped aside, and in the scabbard let my long sword ring home to the pommel's silver, and he bent down to the sombre blood. Then spoke the prince of those with gift of speech. Great captain, a fair wind and the honey lights of home are all you seek. But anguish lies ahead. The god who thunders on the land prepares it, not to be shaken from your track, implacable, in rancor for the son whose eye you blinded. Oh, one narrow strait may take you through his blows, denial of yourself, restraint of shipmates. When you make landfall on Thrinacia first and quit the violet sea, dark on the land, you'll find the grazing herds of Helios, by whom all things are seen, all speech is known. Avoid those kind, hold fast to your intent, and hard seafaring brings you all to Ithaca. But if you raid the beeves, I see destruction for ship and crew. Though you survive alone, bereft of all companions, lost for years under strange sails, shall you come home to find your own house filled with trouble. Insolent men eating your livestock as they court your lady. Aye, you shall make those men atone in blood. But after you have dealt out death in open combat or by stealth to all the suitors, go overland on foot and take an oar until one day you come where men have lived with meat unsalted, never known the sea, nor seen sea-going ships with crimson bows, and oars that fledged light hulls for dipping flight. The spot will soon be plain for you, and I can tell you how. Some passer-by will say, what winnowing fan is that upon your shoulder? Halt, and implant your smooth oar in the turf, and make fair sacrifice to Lord Poseidon, a ram, a bull, a great buck boar. Turn back and carry out pure hecatombs at home to all wide heaven's lords, the undying gods to each in order. Then
Great.
okay.
I think we can stop there.
Yeah. By the way, spoiler alert.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know how to say this other than to say I think you should be a narrator. Maybe like make books on tape or something,
Now
because
that
I
would
love
probably be
hearing you
my other
read that.
job. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, anyhow, if we look at the first question, what does Tiresias tell him, or Odysseus, about the god who thunders on the land? And he tells him, and you heard it, Mrs. Campbell read this, that Poseidon was angry at Odysseus because Odysseus blinded his son, the Cyclops, and was going to make Odysseus suffer. And then look at 624. Tiresias gives Odysseus a warning that has to do with the restraint of Odysseus and his crew. And what is the warning? And the warning is, don't eat of the cattle of Lord Helios, I think, right? Lord
Right.
Helios.
Yeah.
And if you do, there's going to be a consequence. And that consequence is that you will be suffering for years on the ocean trying to find your way home, and you'll lose your entire crew. So, according to Tiresias, what will be the consequences for Odysseus and his crew if either Odysseus or his crew lack restraint? And again, the journey to the underworld is an example you would be able to use in your essay so as to show a heroic quality of Odysseus, how he is special and not just a regular, average, everyday man. However, as we know, he doesn't make it home.
No, and his crew doesn't survive either.
That's right.
And the thing is, he knows this,
Uh,
And if you look at the fact that he doesn't tell the crew, and
yeah,
that part itself, if you're warned by somebody in the underworld, hey, you guys go and slaughter these cows, you're going to die, and I'm going to have to swim in the ocean for a long time. You would think he would tell them, but he
that's
doesn't.
right.
Why
He
doesn't he
doesn't.
tell
He
them?
doesn't. I don't know. I don't know, but it's because maybe because he's just a man,
Yeah, that's it.
who makes
He's
unwise choices because at times that's our nature to make mistakes.
Well, I think too, because if he's the captain and he says don't do it, then he should trust his men to not do it, and they shouldn't have any explanation. And that's, I think, that relates to his hubris. He's,
Mm,
he feels that his crew should do whatever he says, or doesn't do what he says not to do. Um, but he doesn't give them any explanation why. And I think it is because of that human trait in him. So that's what I love about Odysseus, is that he's a paradox, and I think all mankind are a paradox. So
yeah,
that's what I have to
I
say
think
about
you're
that.
right because okay, we'll move on. That sounds like a great way to end that slide. Okay, so divine intervention. Divine intervention in the Odyssey is when a god or goddess interferes in a mortal's life or mortals' lives. And if you turn to page 705 and look at line 1285, students, and begin reading the commentary in italics after that line, now look at the statement that begins with "at this moment." So let me see, 705. Let me see here. 705, and the print is so small for my aged eyes.
Yeah,
Okay,
sucks getting
so
old, students.
yeah, that's right. 1285. Okay. So the italics is Telemachus joins his father in the fight. They are helped by the swineherd and cowherd. Now the suitors trapped in the hall without weapons are struck right and left by arrows, and many of them lie dying on the floor. So that's the italics. And then now look at the statement that begins at this moment. And so the statement is, at this moment, that unmanning thundercloud, the Aegis, Athena's shield, took form aloft in the great hall, and the suitors, mad with fear, at her great sign, stampeded like stung cattle by a river when the dread shimmering
Mm.
like stung cattle by a river when the dread no sorry, I messed that up. Okay, let me start over. And the suitors, mad with fear at her great sign, stampeded like stunned cattle by a river, when the dead shimmering gadfly strikes in summer, in the flowering season, in the long drawn days. After them, the attackers wheeled as terrible as falcons from
Mm.
Eries in the mountains, veering over and diving down with talons wide, unsheathed on flights of birds, who cower down the sky in shoots and bursts along the valley. But the pouncing falcons grip their prey, no frantic wing avails, and farmers love to watch those beaked hunters. So these now fell upon the suitors in that hall, turning to strike and strike again, while torn men moaned at death and blood ran smoking over the whole floor.
I just love how
So,
this happens around Christmas time every year for me.
yeah, isn't that something?
And
Oh
and
my
and
God.
if you've seen the what's that version that came out in the '90s with Armando Santi,
Oh
and
yeah.
there's no birds in that one, but oh my goodness, the blood and gore, and yeah, that's a real good, nice, violent, violent scene there. So,
Yeah, there's no question that justice is done.
oh yeah,
Um, so um, so anyhow, Now, the question I had for you students is which god or goddess intervenes to help Odysseus and Telemachus at this moment in the hall when he's with the suitors, when he and Telemachus are with the suitors? And the answer would be Athena, because the Aegis is her thundercloud that appears and lightning strikes out of it. And it frightened the suitors so as to help Odysseus and Telemachus kill them. And so basically, the deaths of the suitors was what you might say ordained divinely by Athena. Does that make sense?
Right.
Okay.
And it's the other thing about the gods and goddesses is they all had their human favorites. They all had their, like teachers' pets almost, I guess you could say. And Athena really not loved in any kind of romantic way or anything, but Odysseus was one of her favorites when it came to the mortal men. And so so when she helps.
That's right. So can you explain, students, the Homeric simile that follows? And the Homeric simile that follows compares the divine action of Odysseus, or the heroic action rather, of Odysseus and Telemachus killing the suitors, to falcons, the more commonplace action of falcons as birds of prey killing lesser birds in the sky. Now that certainly is an appropriate Homeric simile because of the fact that falcons are birds of prey and are hunters, just as Odysseus and Telemachus are now purposely hunting the suitors to turn the tables on them. Okay,
and one thing you have to, I've noticed this before, when we've taught this to freshmen before, the Homeric similes are really the hardest ones to kind of grasp onto, because there's so much that's described in it that you begin to think that it's the real thing that's happening. But there were no actual birds there. If you do see that production of it, they've got the suitors trapped, and they're just, Odysseus has his bow and arrow, and Telemachus is throwing spears and everything. There's no actual birds. So you have to be careful, because if you look at where the simile actually starts, let's see, where's the like? Blah, 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 blah. Where do we actually start it here?
I think it's down
there it is. As terrible as falcons. So that's where the simile actually starts. And so for the rest of that simile, you've got only the description of the falcons attacking the birds. You forget at this point that this is all being compared to what's going on in that room. So when you look for that heroic simile, if there's something going on that seems kind of out of place, that is probably where there's a simile, a heroic simile. It's not literal.
Good point. And so my point in showing you this, students, was at the bottom of the slide, you'll see it says, again, referencing divine intervention in your essay could help to show that Odysseus is more than just an average everyday man, because of the fact that Athena helps him, as Mrs. Campbell said earlier. So how would divine intervention show that Odysseus is more than an average everyday man? Because he was esteemed by Athena.
Worth saving.
Okay, is there anything else? Worth saving.
Yeah.
Correct.
No,
that's right. Great. Okay. Homecoming. Literary critics sometimes use this term to indicate the homecoming of a hero at the end of a quest in a narrative romance, which is one of the archetypes of stories that we tell, like the Odyssey. A romance, in this case, a narrative romance, doesn't mean like a Hollywood romance or a romance novel that you might find at the grocery store at the checkout stand. What it means is that there's a journey that a hero takes, and then ultimately comes home and restores order. So
And it's a
um,
higher order than when they left it.
that's right, exactly right. So if we look at page 709, line 1408, what we find is Odysseus and Penelope are reunited, and Odysseus can express himself emotionally to her, and she expresses herself emotionally to him. And this image is illustrated and elevated by a kind of formal language by the use of a Homeric simile. And so, what is the Homeric simile, students? And so, if we look at 709, we will see that, let's see, line 1408. Mrs. Campbell, would you like
Sure.
to read that?
Now
Okay.
from his breast into his eyes the ache of longing mounted, and he wept at last, his dear wife, clear and faithful in his arms, longed for as the sun-warmed earth is longed for by a swimmer, spent in rough water where his ship went down under Poseidon's blows, gale winds and tons of sea. Few men can keep alive through a big surf to crawl, clotted with brine, on kindly beaches, in joy, knowing the abyss behind. And so she too rejoiced, her gaze upon her husband, her white arms around him pressed, as though forever.
Wow, you read so beautifully.
Well, hey, that's a great part there. And that is one of my favorite Homeric similes because of not just something different that it's referring to, but it's actually referring to his entire literal experience. You know, so
That's right. That's right.
he is the one that went through Poseidon's blows and the tons of sea and covered with brine, and so it's moving from that tossed about to the shores of the calm waters, and he's there. So the simile is comparing that to finding him in the embrace of Penelope. It's just wonderful.
It's beautiful. It's tremendous. I don't know what else to say besides that. But the reason I brought this to your attention, students, is the bottom here. Perhaps you could use this image and Homeric simile to show how Odysseus demonstrates both the qualities of an epic hero and a regular
Mm-hmm.
mortal man.
Yeah.
Okay, so the threshold guardian. In an epic, the hero must pass from the known world into the unknown world, according to Joseph Campbell.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do this, the hero must pass a threshold guardian who guards the threshold between the known and the unknown worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And there are basically three ways to get beyond the threshold guardian if you are a hero and are going to go on a quest into the unknown world. And so one way is to bribe the guardian with something that he or she wants. And so an example of this is when in the Iliad, Agamemnon, who is a great warrior king in Greece, sacrifices his daughter, who is named Iphigenia, to appease the goddess Artemis, whom he offended by killing a deer in one of her sacred groves. He sacrifices his daughter, that is Agamemnon, sacrifices his daughter so that Artemis will allow the winds to blow, so that he and the other Greeks can sail from Greece to Troy to get Helen back and to punish the Trojans for having taken her. And
Boy,
that's a
those
mouthful,
Greeks were
right?
vicious.
Yeah,
Vicious
I
Greeks.
know. But
Gee.
but for killing his own daughter, and for being unfaithful to his wife, he's
Mm-hmm.
actually killed when he gets home. So there we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Another way, threshold guardians continued. The second way to get beyond a threshold guardian is to fool him or her. And so an example of this is found in the Odyssey when the Cyclops guards the threshold to his cave, having trapped Odysseus's men inside. Odysseus displays his cunning when he fools the Cyclops into becoming inebriated or drunk,
Mm-hmm.
so the men could blind him and allow for their escape. Now, as a side note, it's ironic then that Odysseus yells to the Cyclops, Odysseus' name after he and his men are free, risking his own life and the lives of his crew. And this is an example of how Odysseus demonstrates the heroic ideal in freeing his men, but falls short to human fallibility in saying his name to the Cyclops subsequently.
Mhm.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the consciousness associated with the Cyclops. And there's this term that the mental health community uses called antisocial personality disorder, and you can find this on WebMD. And basically, doctors don't use the other term for this anymore, but the other term that really I want to use is psychopath.
Mhm.
And a psychopath is someone who has absolutely no conscience. Psychopaths are very willing to cause great harm to others, up to and including death, with absolutely no remorse about what they've done to somebody else. And doesn't that sound like the Cyclops?
Oh yeah, yeah. But
So,
and part of it, I think part of it too, is when you look at his history, and the people who had heard about the Cyclops would know what the histories are of these creatures. You know, they're basically shunned by. They're kind of. They're godlike, but they still are. They're kind of halfway between human and more immortal, and they're just, you know, it's kind of like they're half human. Um, that may be where it comes from. I don't know.
well, that's interesting. And so a psychopath does not have a balanced consciousness. He or she has no empathy or feelings for the people he or she hurts, even though the being he or she hurts is in some way, it should be considered to have inherent value because of its consciousness. And so the Cyclops then basically demonstrates this symbolically by the fact that it has only one eye, and the
Mm.
eyes have been said to be like the windows to the soul, and soul could be considered consciousness. So basically, the Cyclops is unbalanced in terms of its consciousness because it's psychopathic.
And then
Um,
that would kind of go with what I was saying, that he's not really there. He's not fully there. Hadn't thought of that before.
Oh, so and I hadn't thought about what you said before about the Cyclops being half human.
Mhm.
So, why is the Cyclops? What makes the Cyclops a psychopath? It's because he kills and eats many of Odysseus's men alive, having absolutely no
Mhm.
concern for their inherent value as humans. Because perhaps in that culture, and I'll get to that in a minute, there is no such thing.
Mhm.
Perhaps. I'm sure there are arguments on both sides of the issue.
Right.
But moreover, he absolutely would have killed Odysseus too if
Mhm.
Odysseus didn't recognize that the Cyclops was a psychopath and refused to give the Cyclops his name.
Mhm.
And so you might remember that Odysseus told the Cyclops that his name was nobody. And
Mhm.
that's why the Cyclops didn't kill Odysseus. So and there was a prophecy among the Cyclopes that said that a warrior or man named Odysseus would blind Polyphemus, the Cyclops. And so Odysseus was wise not to give the Cyclops his name.
Mhm.
And that goes back to what you said earlier about how Odysseus was cunning and all that.
Mhm.
So, moreover, the Cyclops. Now, here's what I wanted to talk about in terms of the context of what the Cyclops does, because the Cyclops was acting in a hierarchy. As part of a hierarchy, one way students describe a hierarchy is kind of a top-down ordering of a system that describes the system's parts or roles in like vertical relation to each other, so that the power principle or the person who plays the role of the power broker is at the top, and that the person or the role with the least power or responsibility is at the bottom. And so the problem, though, with this hierarchy in the context of this society is that it's value based. What I mean by that is that it doesn't simply describe the roles of people, like if you take a church hierarchy, for example, at the top would be like a person designated to fulfill a certain role, like the Pope, for example. And then beneath the Pope in this objective hierarchy would be uh, like the bishops and then the priests and oh, I forgot the cardinals. So it'd be the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, the deacons, and then maybe like the laity at the bottom. Okay, that's an objective hierarchy, and that's, I think, valid because it describes the roles of people. It does not, however, describe in a subjective way the inherent value of beings. So in this Greek hierarchy of the gods at the top and humans beneath them, there is this inherent subjective value whereby the humans are less valuable than the gods and therefore they can be trampled on.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question to students was going to be, do we have any of these hierarchies that still exist in our modern culture that don't simply describe the roles in an organization, but describe the value of people in the organization?
If you look at, of course, this is not recent, but even in the Titanic, the way that the everybody was placed on the ship was hierarchical based on what their financial situation was. And it's why when the ship went down, the majority of the people who were saved were of the rich because they were closest to the top of the ship and were able to get to the boats before any of those in the lower berths did. And so it's always been this social hierarchy based on what people have. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you know, I would argue that we have seen certainly hierarchical ideals concerning race, concerning culture, concerning creed, all those things, social status, economic status, sex, and other categories, like perhaps even like being of lower rank in a system or organization that qualifies those people in some people's minds, in the power brokers' minds, of being contemptible or of being less inherently valuable than the power brokers are. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so that's, I think, the hierarchy that we're talking about generally in terms of the way the Cyclops acts. And we see this also in other characters like Zeus and the way he treats mortal women, and then what Hera does afterwards in changing them into rocks and trees and rivers. It's
fighters.
Like, yeah.
Well, Hera didn't do that. Did Hera do that one, or was that one Athena?
No, I think it was a different goddess. I don't remember which one though.
Yeah.
But I do remember. What I was going to say is that humans become inherently valueless and the playthings of these creatures or that are above them in this hierarchy of value that devalues humans.
Right.
Okay. So, right. Okay. So,
yeah, we're running low on time here too, by the way. Just want to let you know it's 10 o'clock.
Okay, all right. So I'll just be really quick. Okay, the third way to get beyond a threshold guardian is to engage in mortal combat with the guardian. That is not the wisest course of action, however, as threshold guardians are often bigger and stronger than epic heroes. However, it may be successfully done, as Odysseus shows at the end of the Odyssey, as he and his son engage in mortal combat with the suitors who have become the threshold guardians of his home, for preventing his real homecoming. So you may recall that Athena gives him a gift prior to him going into his home, and that gift is the disguise of a beggar. And this kind of gift is often referred to as the gift of the goddess. Though Athena assists Odysseus in this manner, and this is referred to as divine intervention, it is Odysseus who still is heroic and wise enough to accept or help. So, would you like to say anything about that as a closing remark, Mrs. Campbell?
Just that when it comes to these roles, these archetypal roles, there are what they call shapeshifters. And sometimes the threshold guardian, it could even be the mentor, could be even some of the others that are the nemesis can even be the threshold guardian. So when you think of Harry Potter or the Hunger Games, who would be the threshold guardian then? So you have to think who is preventing continuance, and then how does that person continue on? So it's again, it's archetypal, and that you need to have this confrontation with the threshold guardian in order to pass to the next part of the Odyssey.
Really nicely said. Great. Okay, so I guess we should call it quits here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being part of this discussion. You've provided so many excellent points, and I must say, I really, really, really enjoyed hearing you read. I'd like to hear you read some more.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Well,
okay. And maybe depending on, hopefully we can get to the other part of your presentation in the next session. So, we'll see how many we have and see what we need to do there. So.
Okay, well, I think basically this is pretty much all I wanted. Well, I do have more questions and things like that, but yeah.
Do you want to just show them? Because remember, when the students listen to this, they do need to respond to let us know that they've gone through and actually listened to this. So do you have a couple of questions you can leave them with that they could respond to as proof that they've watched this?
Sure, here they are. Okay, these are at the end of my presentation. Some questions to consider. In which ways is Odysseus heroic? Mm-hmm. In which ways is Odysseus like a normal man? What are his negative traits? From what you've observed of Odysseus, how would you describe what the Greeks valued in a hero? Okay. And I think the students will be able to pause the mm-hmm. thing here and see this, so I can just go on now to the next screen.
Right.
Does Odysseus display obedience to divine powers? When? Is obedience to divine powers valued today? Does Odysseus display a love of home and family? How? Is a love of home and family valued today like it was back then? And here are some more. How does Penelope test Odysseus after the battle? Why is it ironic that Odysseus returns to his kingdom dressed as a beggar? And do you think Odysseus's revenge on the suitors and maids is excessive or too brutal? And then finally, so is Odysseus noble or not? What are some reasons either way? Those are the questions.
Okay. So when you guys are watching this, listening to it, make sure that you put in a paragraph saying, and in response to the seminar questions, I would like to say, and then when you add that to your own response to the discussion board questions, that's how you get those points. And one thing I'd like to point out is that that's worth 10 points out of the 25. So if you don't respond to these recordings, you are failing the activity, basically, even if you do respond in writing to those questions. So make sure that you actually do go and respond to those questions.
Okay, so thank you so much, Mrs. Campbell. I appreciate your time so very much.
Thank you too.
Okay,
bye-bye.